Hi, Martin.
Hi, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. This is now the third one I think we've done, which is great. It's fantastic. And I don't think you need any introduction, and we'll get on to talking a bit more about the safeguarding company as well. But I think I want everyone to understand that this is actually a sort of special fireside chat. So we're going to focus on a specific incident regarding safeguarding, and the reason for doing that, and both of us have talked about it many times, is ultimately safeguarding is such a big issue in schools and actually across the society, and how we protect our children. I think it was worth not just talking in a general concept around safeguarding, but focus on an incident that's happened within a school, and so we can walk through it. And I think there's two elements. You, as the expert, can talk about what should have been done, and probably from a layman's perspective, I can ask questions about how I would probably feel as a layman. I've not had any training, I'm not a DSL, so there's lots of elements where I would find it very, very difficult actually to deal with, safeguarding incidents within a school framework, for sure. So I think that's where we want to sort of kick off from, if that's okay. Yeah, and I think the subject matter or the incident that we want to talk about is very much about this child Q that was, obviously was quite heavily put into the press and the media. It's been talked about a lot. And this is about a child a teenager, I'm guessing, in the school, who ultimately got strip searched for the purposes of trying to identify and trying to find drugs. And I think, and which is, to me, you sort of, from a layman's perspective, you sort of go, oh yeah, I can understand why they're trying to identify and find drugs, and they could be hidden. But I think there's obviously much, much more to this than meets the eye. And I thought, actually, I hope you don't mind. So Martin, if we can sort of step through this process of what you think happened and how it happened and what should have been checked and what differences should have been, what people should have done differently, then that would be really good, if that's okay.
Sure, Nick, thanks. So I think the important first thing to say is that we're going to use this case study to discuss some principles, if you like, rather than necessarily revisiting this particular case with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. Because we weren't there, we weren't the people responsible for making the decisions, but there are some huge issues. I mean, it's as well to reflect the learning that always has to follow any incident, however serious or less serious, it doesn't matter. If matters of principle arise out of it, it's really important we address those, because quite often they're not addressed in safeguarding training. I'm sorry to say, quite often they are published at the time to a blaze of publicity, and then very quickly forgotten, or people just nod to them. Well, of course, there was that awful case. Move on. And for me, you should never forget, because, talk about lessons will be learned. There really are some important lessons from this particular case review and others. This year is the 10th anniversary of the death of Daniel Pelker. And it's as well to reflect on that, and to reflect on the fact that it's actually 50 years next year since the death of Maria Colwell, when society at large started to talk much more widely about child protection issues. Now, recently, the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel has done a review of safeguarding, and guess what? They've identified all the same issues that were identified in the Maria Colwell inquiry nearly 50 years ago. So to say that we've got to be relentless about this stuff is an understatement. And so it's hugely important to learn the lessons. And Child Q is a really important case practice review to look at some really important principles and the day-to-day challenges facing educators. So in very simple terms, staff at the school, Child Q, she was 15 years old, came to school, and staff suspected that she smelled of cannabis. they carried out a search of the child's clothing and a bag, and didn't find any drugs. So they decided to call the police. Now, it was in the middle of COVID, and the Safer Schools police officer that normally worked with that school wasn't available. Mm-hmm. So 2 patrol officers were sent to the school, a male and a female, and met with teachers who explained their suspicions. So another 2 police officers were called because the intention of the police officers was to search child Q themselves, and that required 2 female police officers. So the first 2 officers called another 2 officers so that there could be 2 female officers at the school. So now we've got 4 police officers at the school. And without an appropriate adult being present, and without the mother of child Q being contacted at all, the 2 female police officers took child Q into a medical room at the school and strip searched her for drugs. Now, the actual drug that they were looking for was cannabis. So in terms of the kind of legal terms of necessity and proportionality, there's some real questions about, so was it necessary and proportionate to search child Q and to strip search child Q in a school setting for cannabis? Now, with all police search activity, there needs to be a risk assessment, and there needs to be an assessment of actually what evidence do we have that this person, do we have reasonable suspicion that this person is in possession of drugs? Now, what's interesting is that this must be a daily dilemma faced by educators up and down the country. And in fact, as you know, Mike and I wrote a book about safeguarding in education that was published last year. And without any knowledge of child Q, because the case practice review hadn't been published at the time, we created a case study around a child coming to school smelling of cannabis. And actually, we posed the question in that case study about, well, if that's the case, if you suspect that a child, comes to school smelly of cannabis, their clothing smells of cannabis. What's that telling you, and what are the kind of questions you need to be asking yourself about that before you take any action? The primary one being, is this child at risk? They may be using cannabis, depending on their age. Yeah. But if their clothing smells of cannabis, does that mean they actually live in a household where cannabis is being smoked in their presence, which has clearly got potential health issues and also a potential to encourage that child that smoking cannabis isn't harmful and it's something they ought to do? Is it an indication, as it sometimes is, of other criminal activity in that household that that child is being subject to? But if I raise that as a teacher, that particular issue, oh, I've got a child smells of cannabis, there could be consequences. Do we tell the police of our suspicions? Was one of the questions we posed. If we do tell the police, is there a possibility that they'll actually end up going around and searching the child's home, for example? Will it create a situation where the police find drugs at home and the child is arrested? And the parents are arrested? What are the consequences of me reporting those suspicions to the police as a teacher in a school? And there's some really tricky issues in that, and yet it's not the sort of thing that gets widely discussed. Now, in the child Q case, mother wasn't contacted.
But Martin, just to go back onto that point, so going back to as a layman, I would find that really difficult, because part of me would be going, if the police say that to the parent and it's criminal activity, what might happen to me? I know it's a very selfish point of view, but that would definitely be part of my thinking.
And that's exactly one of the issues we raised, Nick, as well, is part of the personal risk assessment that teacher must be carrying out, whether consciously or unconsciously, is, so what happens to me if I report this and the parents are a criminal family, or part of a criminal network? What's the consequences for me? As a teacher, I might have my own child at that school. So what's the consequences for my child if I'm seen as a snitch?
Yeah.
Now, nobody's suggesting there are easy answers to these questions. They are fundamentally very difficult questions. But if you don't talk about them, because people don't feel confident to talk about it, or it's just, oh no, we're all professionals and we'll all do the right thing always, well, that's not humanity. That's not the human experience, is it? There's a reality here for educators around the implications of reporting things like suspected drug use, by a pupil. And sometimes they can be very young pupils. This is a child whose clothing might smell of cannabis. This might be a child who's 6 or 7 years old, who's clearly not consuming cannabis themselves. But actually, what's going on at home must be the question that you ask yourself if you are the teacher or the safeguarding leader in a school, and what's the potential harm to this child? So it's a complicated issue.
And do you think that question is different if it's about that young child might be mixing actually just with older children who are smoking it, or is it the family? I suppose actually, I'm asking the question, really, I suppose, because I'm not sure. But do you treat it slightly differently in the sense of you sort of go, well, that is much more of a threat, or you have to be a bit more considerate because it's the parent or the family? I don't know. How would you? Do you think it's different, or do you just treat it the same?
I think it's interesting. The Child Q practice review talks about the girl herself being treated as the risk, not being treated as being at risk.
Okay.
And I think what you've always got to do is to look and say, what is the risk to this child? There is a great deal of research being done around the experience of children in the criminal justice system. Now, what we haven't mentioned so far is that Child Q was a black child. And there is a significant amount of research being done in the experience of black children, Asian children, and children from other minoritized ethnic communities in criminal justice. So what we have in the Child Q case, for example, is we have a child smelling of cannabis. She's been searched at school. Now, the DFE has issued guidance back in 2018 about the fact that students can be searched at school for prohibited items, but it limits the extent of that search. So it doesn't, for example, permit strip searching of pupils, but it does allow school staff to search pupils if they think they're carrying what are called prohibited items, which could be weapons, could be drugs, and so forth. So you have a situation where it's suspected that this child is in possession of cannabis because she smells of cannabis. Well, that's a bit of a leap in itself to begin with. You know, the fact that she smells of cannabis, does that necessarily indicate she's in possession of cannabis? So, you know, already we're going down a path of reasoning that leads us to a course of action where actually maybe we should have paused and actually thought, what does this mean? What's it telling us? And actually, what's the risk to this child?
And you, like you said, she's 15, so young, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where this term, adultification, comes from in relation to the perception of children from particular communities, because some research by the MSPCC, research by writers in social work, has identified very clearly that there is a perception that children who are Black or from Asian communities or other minorities, ethnic communities, are in some way more streetwise than other children, that they are less deserving of nurturing and protection. And a study by Georgetown Law in the USA actually identified about Black girls, that the perception was that Black girls from the age of 5 were seen as less worthy of nurturing and protection because they were seen as being more streetwise.
Oh my God.
And therefore more prone to criminal behavior, if you want to put it that way. So this kind of mindset around, well, child Q smells of cannabis, she's 15 years old, what's this telling us? You know, really needs to be thought through, you know, in these situations. And again, we weren't there, but if you read the case practice review, you know, I think we have to take those to be the facts of the situation.
And from a social perspective, we're stripping away that child's innocence, really, in the sense of saying you're not a child. What you're saying is adultification is literally saying we're going to treat you like an adult.
Yeah,
oh, no.
Absolutely. And that's, if you like, if you look at, you know, all of the kind of the UN Convention on the Rights of Children, all of those sorts of processes and policies and people that have thought long and hard about this make it very, very clear that you start from the premise that this is a child who is potentially at risk. Mm. We don't start with a criminal justice response. You know, so it really does, you know, we used to talk in criminal justice about kind of, you know, the fruit of the poison tree.
Yeah.
You know, if you start with the poison tree, if your first thought, if where you start from is not the right place to start from, that everything that flows from it then actually just worsens the situation.
Yeah.
Now, there are some you know, other factors in this case, but again, you know, when you think it through, does this justify the action that was taken? So, for example, on a previous occasion, child Q had been identified by teachers at the school as being, in their words, intoxicated, and she smelt of cannabis on a previous occasion. And her mother had been involved at the time, the police weren't involved, and they were told, the mother was told in no uncertain terms, and the child, if this continued, that then there would be a big question mark over her continued place at the school. In other words, she'd be excluded. Now, what we have here in the second incident, if you like, the one that's the subject of the case practice review, have we got people building on knowledge from a previous occasion, their perception of the situation, that actually prevents them from treating this incident on its own facts and its own merits? Are we actually, you know, conflating these two situations and suggesting that the second incident, the strip search, actually was necessary because of what happened before? Well, there may occasionally be, you know, reasons in any investigation where a previous set of circumstances might justify further action being taken. But you have to say, in this particular circumstance, the facts just don't seem to support that. and the situation should have been treated on its merits. Now, it's hugely complex. You know, we have teachers here who have a suspicion, they've carried out a search. Now, at this stage, you have to say, well, why did they call the police? What was their expectation of calling the police? They've already carried out a search of this child, so what did they expect the police to do? Was their expectation that the police would do a more extensive search of the child? And the review suggests that that might have been in the mind, you know, that might have been a factor in why they called the police. Were they just calling the police for advice? But what happened was, of course, that we get into a criminal justice response.
Yeah.
Instead of actually saying, well, hold on a minute, what's the risk to this child? So what if she's been using cannabis? Actually, that's a health risk. And she's potentially being exposed to criminal activity and committing crimes herself. We've got to protect her from that risk.
Do you think potentially, and I don't know this child at all, neither of us do, but do you think maybe attitude, but then I suppose, you know, that's children do normally try and defend themselves with attitude, I guess, is, you know, with all our own children, we know that they will defend themselves through attitude, but do you think there's an element of that? Do you think there would have been those teachers, again, with all the other things, you know, so you've got avocation, you've got smelling of cannabis and prior sort of maybe smelling of cannabis and sort of trying to put the dots together, I suppose, in your head. Yeah, do you think that on top of that as well, maybe some form of attitude as well, sort of quick, was what was the quick sort of motive for phoning the police or not?
It's difficult to say from the evidence in inverted commas in the review, but I think the important thing to say is, so what? Frankly, you know, if you're experienced in dealing with children, you know that sometimes in the parlance, they cop an attitude. We all know that. That's not evidence. You know, and when you actually look at people's reaction under stress and in certain situations, and this is described about child Q in this situation, actually, is you've got normally, people talk about fight or flight, don't they? When we're in a stress situation, you know, you either fight or you run away. There's a third element to that, which is freeze. I don't know what to do. I'm like a rabbit caught in the headlights, so I don't fight or flight. I just freeze, and I don't actually interact at all. There's a fourth one called fawn, F-A-W-N.
Okay.
And this is about people who comply. They adopt a submissive role because they're worried about the consequences of not cooperating.
Yep.
And actually, rather than fighting verbally or otherwise, it would appear that what happened on this occasion was that child Q, instead of saying, hold on a minute, you're intending to search me, strip search me. Oh, and by the way, what the school and the police officers also knew was that she was menstruating at the time.
Oh, man.
So
even more vulnerable.
Yeah, hugely vulnerable. So, you know, she actually adopted what is called in the psychological sort of parlance of this, the fawn role. She actually acquiesced and kind of submitted to the process, if you like. Now, in a sense, there is clearly, you know, a lot of issues about the decision-making process that led to that search taking place.
Yeah.
Which is almost immaterial compared to the consequences.
Yeah.
So at the macro level, this was in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was within months of this huge concern in the Black community about the way they're treated by law enforcement and other agencies. So there is potentially a huge level of distress, mistrust, fear in that community already. So actually, you've got to think about context. So this whole issue about contextual safeguarding in an incident like this is hugely important. You've got to think far more widely than this small individual incident about cannabis, let's remember, to the consequences. So there's a huge consequence for the Black community of an incident like this. And you can only imagine, not being a member of that community, how that feels.
Yeah.
The kind of next step around that is, what about the consequences for this child? Now, we know from many, huge amount of evidence about adverse childhood experiences and how repeated adverse childhood experiences result in children, when they grow up, having less chance of getting a job, less chance of forming a relationship, more chance of going to prison, far more chance of abusing drugs and alcohol, and far more chance of committing suicide. So we know that about children. So let's just think about this experience that we're going to put this child through in this school. We're going to search her, strip search her, in a school where she's entitled to feel safe, while she's menstruating, for cannabis. And you have to say to yourself, in the context of this child's life, this is a hugely significant event and very, very traumatic. So, and of course, when you then think about the impact on the child, you then must think about, obviously, the impact on the family of that child. And of course, both her mother and her aunt were interviewed by the Case Practice Review and talk about how this outgoing, bubbly child has become withdrawn, has started self-harming, has academically fallen off a cliff compared to where she was. So we've got huge impact at a kind of societal level, at the individual level for that child, for the family, for the community. So our decision making is absolutely critical. So the way we think about these incidents, is absolutely, you can't overstress its importance because of the consequences. Talk about begin with the end in mind, and it's a phrase we often talk about in safeguarding, is just think about what the potential consequences of this could be. And let's go back to what we were thinking about right at the beginning. We've got a 15-year-old girl who smells of cannabis. We ought to be concerned about her welfare. Now, it could be argued that one of the reasons for wanting to search her was to ensure that she didn't ingest any further drugs that might have been in her possession. And that might have been a genuinely held belief of the teachers and the police officers, that to protect that child, one of the things they had to do was to ensure that she wasn't in possession of more drugs that either she would use herself or that she would pass on to other children at the school. So extremely important to bear that in mind. So if that's our concern and that's our objective, then actually, were there other ways of handling that situation that would have achieved the same objective without the trauma of a strip search on school premises? So, for example, could the child have been supervised until the arrival of the mother? If the mother, for some reason, was thought not to be an appropriate adult in these circumstances, and again, I'm not commenting on the individuals, but if that was the decision of those involved at the time, then what's the problem with supervising that child until another appropriate adult can actually be brought to the school and sit with the child and the issues explained to both of them, and actually find another way of resolving this situation that doesn't involve police officers strip searching a child on school premises. You know, and you know, for me, that's kind of, you know, if you accept all the good intentions about protecting the child from drugs and all the rest of it, the action that followed seems to me to be wholly disproportionate.
Yeah.
Now, there's another concept here, I think, in play called intersectionality.
Okay.
So, again, many of the concepts have been around for a long time, but we don't introduce them into safeguarding training, and they're absolutely critical concepts, actually.
Yeah.
Adultification is one. Intersectionality is about saying, right, if you look at an individual, and we are all in a minority of one at the end of the day,
yeah,
what are the things that actually might impact on the vulnerability of an individual, or might be factors that we need to take into account when we're making decisions about a person's welfare or what action we might take in a situation like this. So we know, for example, in our society that there are issues about the safety and equality of women and girls. Yeah. There's been a lot of stuff written about violence against women and girls. It's been a huge focus, and the research that was done into peer-on-peer abuse in schools, now called child-on-child abuse, very clearly identified issues surrounding the sexual harassment and sexual violence towards girls by boys, predominantly in our schools.
Yep.
So we already know that there's a major issue with gender in our schools. Child Q is also a member of the Black community. We know the many, many issues and challenges facing members of the Black community, whether it's educational achievement, whether it's in criminal justice, whether it's in employment. We know that there are many, many issues that affect Black, Asian, and other minority ethnic communities. So we've now got an intersection in this particular case between the gender, this girl here that we're dealing with, a young female, and she's a Black young female. Add to that, she's a child in law, in the eyes of the law. So she's female, she's child, she's Black. Now, other things, so this is where these issues intersect. So when and that's the point of intersectionality. So when we think about this, if this child, for example, was also disabled, that would be another factor that was to account when we're thinking about how we support and deal with difficult issues when we're dealing with these children. So, we have, in a sense, we've got this whole issue around adultification. We've got issues of intersectionality here to consider. Now, these are complex concepts.
There's no doubt, since we've been talking, my brain, I've been writing things down because there's so many elements to this.
Absolutely. Do we address that properly in police training? Well, we do some of it. We do stuff about equality and whatever. But actually, do we do it, to this level, of understanding that we really need to think about? I certainly know that in safeguarding training, we absolutely do not do this. It would be a real exception for any of these issues to be addressed properly in safeguarding training.
Yeah.
For all the reasons that I think we've probably discussed previously, actually, that there is no national syllabus for safeguarding training. Anybody can set themselves up as a safeguarding trainer. I've certainly sat through safeguarding training sessions where somebody from a local authority has shown me 63 PowerPoint slides, all of which were pretty much of no relevance whatsoever to my duties as a school governor. So actually, you know, there's a huge gap.
And the thing is, it does, you know, do you think it should be scenario-based training? The reason I say this is you've touched on psychology, you know, in the sense of like fawn and freeze. I've never heard of fawn before in my life, by the way. So there's an element of things I would treat probably somebody who is just complete compliant. I'd probably just go, yeah, they probably feel a little bit guilty, maybe. Even in my head, I might be going, yeah, I feel a little bit guilty. That's why they're going along with what I'm asking them to do. But there's definitely elements here which, you know, I wouldn't even I wouldn't have thought about as part of a scenario and the things to think about. So do you think it should be more, I know we're moving away slightly from child cue, we'll definitely come back to it. But do you think that, because it's so important, this training, obviously, but do you think it should be, you know, it's scenario based, or do you think it, you know, you just think it should be wider and psychology should be in there and all these other different elements?
Well, both, Nick. I think there's an element of education. People need to understand some of these psychological concepts in the first place. But then they do need to go on and do some scenario-based training where they apply that learning. You know, we used to, you know, when I was in the police service, and this was introduced in the wake of the, you know, the awful and tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence, that the police introduced scenario-based training, immersive scenario-based training that we would go on for 3 days at a time. You know, it would be like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. This was, you know, and you would work in syndicates, and it was very high quality. And so, for example, news reports were generated by well-known news readers that were played to us as the investigators or the responding officers, whatever role we were in. They would then bring along role players to play the family of a victim, and we would interact with them as if we were the investigating officer. We would give media interviews, and we would be interviewed by top flight journalists, all as part of this immersion into getting it as real as it possibly can be, so you get as much experiential learning as you can.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid this sheep dipping with PowerPoint slides doesn't cut it.
No.
In any way, shape or form. And if we're going to get good at this stuff, and we're actually going to stop doing what we did 50 years ago when Maria Colwell died, then we need to get serious about some of this training. And it does require investment, you know, and it needs leadership at the highest level. You know, if we leave this to a local authority or a MAT or individual schools to decide how they're going to do safeguarding training, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom and something nice will happen. Well, we're never going to get to the level that, frankly, our staff deserve. Because we deserve to provide this level of support to our educators so that they do understand and don't find themselves in dilemmas without a framework for knowing how to think about them and how to work through them. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And ultimately, it's got, you know, and man, you know, based on some of the things you've been talking about today, you know, it's got stopping the sort of tick box. Like, have you got a system to record this information? Yes, I have done. You know, have you been on the any form of DSL training? Yeah, I did. Yeah, you know, because these are complicated matters, and I, you know, I said at the very beginning, I would find it really difficult. And I think I'm a logical, sensible. I hope I am anyway. You know, sort of adult. But I would find it really, really difficult in some of these scenarios.
Yeah, completely. I mean, we talk about the safeguarding mindset, you know, and this is what underpins safeguarding culture. And what's really interesting in the child Q case is that they tackle this issue of unconscious bias, as it's called.
Yeah.
So we know in the wake of Stephen Lawrence, that the Metropolitan Police were found to be institutionally racist. And this notion of institutional bias or systemic bias really at times feels like a bit of a cop-out, because actually it infers for a start that it just happened and nobody really noticed. Oh, it just crept into our policies and our procedures and our behavior, our attitudes, the action we take, the decisions we take. Oh, we didn't really notice, but you're right. It is prejudiced, and it isn't. Come on, guys, come on. So the Child Q case review really addresses this head on. And I'm going to read this out because it really is, for me, a fundamental issue around this stuff. It says the review has intentionally avoided the use of unconscious bias. In the opinion of both the review and its reference group, as a term, this somewhat excuses the actions of those involved. It gives the perception that agencies and its practitioners aren't accountable for what they say or do, and that they are unable to pause, reflect, and consciously control their actions. It similarly suggests that the behavior and culture within organizations can't be changed. The review disagrees. I've just spent the last few months laboring on a paper about a culture of safeguarding because it's spattered across working together and keeping children safe in education. But what does it actually mean? The kind of where I got to, in the shortest term, is culture is values in action. But actually, it's now 7,000 words in it, because actually all
a lot of action.
Yeah, exactly. Because there are so many of these issues. We've all heard, in our training about recruitment and selection, about the horns and halo effect, and all these sorts of things. But there are a number of other really important issues like optimism bias, like adultification, that are hugely important to safeguarding. So for there to be a culture of safeguarding has to be based on some very clear values, one of which is actually learning and understanding and putting into practice the very best, professional approach to safeguarding. And that means that we've got to think more deeply about it. I think that one of the final things I say in the paper is the best decision I ever took was to think more about the way I think.
That's great. No, that's good. I'm with you. I think that you're absolutely right. And the more I think about it, it's the same with that. All we're doing is basically trying to be nice to people who have. I appreciate they probably, is probably a trait or a pattern already in their minds, and they haven't chosen to think enough about it. But it's still bias, and actually, whatever you say, whatever action you do, actually it's always conscious. There is no such thing as unconscious, really. You're actually doing something, you're actioning something. So, you have to take responsibility for it. In which case, then you need to learn from it. If you don't like it, which is fine, we all have traits we don't like about ourselves. That means you have to learn from them. You have to learn and change those traits. Yeah,
absolutely. It is fundamental to us being better at looking after each other. That we actually, the truth is, we can't give you all the answers to safeguarding culture. You kind of got to work it out for yourself. And the only way that you'll work it out for yourself is to look inside yourself to start with. And get the people you work with to look inside themselves and strip away all the hubris and the, professional veneer, and actually get down to it at a really human level, and then start building. It's a complex topic, but actually it just requires you to think about it. Start with thinking, and child Q just raises so many important issues of principle about the way we think and why we think that way, that actually that situation could have been handled in a very, very different way without the trauma for everybody that flowed from it, because it's been very, very uncomfortable for the teachers involved. Make no mistake.
Yeah.
They probably thought the police were going to do something, but did they really think the police were going to search a girl on, strip search a menstruating girl on school premises? That's certainly, I'm guessing, not what those teachers intended to happen.
No.
But it's a consequence of what happened.
But before, sorry to check. Sorry, Martin, I'm talking over you. But before we move on to the part where the police were there, so if you were, so do you think? So actually, rather than asking a question, sort of saying, would you do it this way?
No.
What would you, if you went through that process? So basically, a teacher came to you and said, I'm assuming they went to a senior leader of some sort and said, by the way, or the DSL, by the way, this child, basically is smelling of cannabis. How would you then take that all the way up to, and we'll stop because I don't think you would have involved the police. So the part of dealing with it, what would the process be?
Well, I think for a start, you'd be thinking about, right, who do we need to engage in a conversation to try and resolve this concern we've got?
Okay.
Because searching the child is only one way of resolving that concern.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be thinking about all of the legal issues, because I'm a former police officer. I'd be thinking about necessity, proportionality. Is this legal? Strictly, it might be legal, but actually not if you haven't developed reasonable suspicion yourself. Not if, and this is where, you can develop reasonable suspicion on the basis of what somebody else has told you. But if they've told you, my suspicion is this child smells of cannabis, go and strip search them. I'm kind of missing something in the middle here, because I'm pretty sure that my reaction, if I'd have been called there as a police officer, would have been, let me get this right. So let's just talk about what the situation is here and what options have we got. And we appear to have gone for one option and stuck with it, which is search. And actually, what you should be doing, and this is, the classic kind of method in any police operation, actually, is, so what are the options here? Because we've got a number of different courses of action that we could take. So what are they? Well, search is one of them. Involving the parent is another one. Involving another appropriate adult is another one. Involving somebody from, a local youth organisation who, might be, there are a range of other options beyond searching this child. It's, there's always this kind of, oh, we've got to resolve this. We've got to resolve this. Well, have you? It may be, it may be important, but how urgent is it actually? Can we supervise this child in a way to ensure that she doesn't come to harm and she doesn't try and harm somebody else, if that's our suspicion, without going straight for the, well, let's do a strip search option? And I think it all goes back to the way you think. What am I seeing in front of me? And it feels like we have an escalation here from something that, in the scale of things, is fairly mundane to begin with.
Yeah.
We pretty much escalate very, very quickly to, well, let's do a strip search then. Now, none of us were privy to the conversations that took place, what was said to whom, and all the rest of it. But, the Child Safeguarding Practice Review is pretty clear that, there wasn't any other huge burning evidence that would have pointed us in that direction other than that we've been told in the review. And on the face of it, That's not strong.
Yeah, and I guess you're right about the point you just made. Sometimes as adults, which is actually a bit of a child trait in the sense of it's a child mindset. We almost get ourselves, many adults together can sometimes create a frenzy. They can create a bit of a mindset of, oh yeah, why aren't we doing something? They get overexcited almost, and you sort of go, where was the calm voice?
Classic groupthink, isn't it? Another thing that we ought to be talking about in safeguarding training. Another classic example. Right. We must do something. Are we all agree what it is? Yes, we're all agree what it is. Right, right, off we go. And you always need that person in the room that goes, hold on a minute, really? And actually brings everybody back down to earth. And that's where cool, calm heads, careful consideration, not rushing into a situation, not seeking to resolve it. And you can see, how busy teachers, busy police officers wanting to get this job done and dealt with. You can kind of see where that mentality, that mindset comes from. Now, again, I don't want to be criticizing individuals. I don't know them and I wasn't there. But you can see how that kind of stuff happens.
Yeah.
And we've all seen it happen. We've all seen it happen in the workplace, haven't we? We've got to do something about this. Well, let's have a fantastic campaign to do this, that, or the other. And everybody rushes off and starts spending money and doing things.
Yeah.
What's our objective here?
You need that critical thinker, don't you? That person who just goes, everyone stop, put your feet back on the ground.
Yeah.
Right, now let's have a look at this and dissect it in, exactly what we're trying to achieve. What's the objective of what we're trying to achieve?
No,
and that probably leads on to another question. So because at the moment, the number of DSLs who tell me, you sort of go, right, okay, so, how did you become a DSL? I was picked, I was the person who didn't step back quickly enough. And you go, all right. So if we're talking about these sort of critical thinkers, actually it's something that should be really considered about who is the right person to be a DSL.
Oh, you must have read the book, Nick.
I know.
Because again, it's a critical point. It's an absolutely critical point. The truth is that if you become a head teacher of a primary school, you're pretty much anointed as the DSL. Whether or not you've got any aptitude, interest, previous experience, we just assume that because you're the head teacher and you're a teacher, and therefore you're part of the profession, and therefore you will have, a huge interest and great aptitude and enormous skill and empathy to be able, and the knowledge to enable you to do this job. Well, we all know that's nonsense. If you did a competency-based selection process for somebody to be a safeguarding lead, actually, would the job description mirror that of a head teacher? Some of it might.
Yeah.
But that's not how people are selected to be DSLs. Now, a growing number of bigger schools and certainly multi-academy trusts are appointing full-time safeguarding leads who are not always from the teaching profession and who have been selected on the basis of skill, knowledge, ability, aptitude, interest in safeguarding. But it's a journey that's going to take too long unless we do something about it.
Yeah.
Because it will just be drip, 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 over many years while schools get into maths over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever the timetable ends up being.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. We're asking people to do something, I think, without the proper levels of selection, recruitment, selection, training, development, support, and it's a big gap. And it leads to bad decisions, and it actually puts the staff member in a hugely vulnerable situation. You know, I talk to head teachers often who spend 2 or 3 days a week dealing with safeguarding issues. You know, that's not unusual in a primary school. If you're the head teacher in the DSL, you will be spending a lot of your time dealing with parents, dealing with children around safeguarding issues.
Yeah.
And without the proper level of preparation and support, and we know, you know, because we get the questions coming to us, and you know, we're always going to support and answer them. Well, I've got this difficult situation, you know, no names, but in this type of situation, what do you think we ought to be thinking about? You know, but without that kind of level of support, immersive learning, education of actually all of these psychological principles and so on and so forth, very, very difficult actually for people who are charged with the education of, you know, a great many children. And of course, quite often you'll find that safeguarding issues will only affect a subset of the total student body.
Yep.
Everyone is, you know, a potential victim, in inverted commas, you know, so you have to be eternally vigilant. But the point is that many head teachers, you know, will tell you, and you will know as well as I do, that they spend a disproportionate amount of their time dealing with a small group of children who pose very significant issues.
But the thing is, you know, if we all believe that every child should meet their potential, it's so important, because some of the, you know, as you've just been talking about with Child Q, some of this stuff, you know, if you don't get it right, it's irreversible in some cases, or very hard to reverse.
Yeah.
So we have to get it right.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that I've seen some recent kind of discussion in the media about the need for all head teachers to have some kind of qualification in special educational needs, so that they properly understand it.
Yep.
Well, I'd argue that there is no qualification in safeguarding. I've been on a course, you know, there are organisations like the NSPCC that do offer safeguarding training, so you can go out and get qualified, but there is no standard in education and no standard qualification in education to become a safeguarding lead. And I think that's vitally important. You must be able to demonstrate occupational competence.
Yeah, I think that is. I think lots of this training as well, I've seen, is a lot of it is online. You know, how do you know that person has really taken it on? And when they hit, you know, because we all can deal with theoretical situations. You know, you can learn the theoretical situation. I'll get there in a minute. Yeah, we can learn that and feel that we're competent, but when a real life scenario happens, it basically, you know, because it doesn't work like a book. It doesn't, you know, these sort of situations, as we've just been talking about, or as you've been talking about, you know, psychological situations, you know, where the state of mind is the child in, you know, the intersectionality of it all, the context, you know, how can you really, unless you have that mindset, number one, where you've grown that mindset where you can break things down and work out how serious a situation is or how vulnerable the child is at the particular point in time and how quickly you should deal with it. All those things, you know, you've been talking about, you know, that's not something you can just go, right, well, step one, step two, step three.
That's absolutely right. You know, there is no workflow that says kind of do this, do this, do this, do this.
And we're all
every
happy.
situation is different. Yeah, exactly. You know, and it really is something that we need to take much more seriously. Yeah. You know, the support and education of people who we expect to do safeguarding.
So now, going on, so we've got